Hisham Aidi is a professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He's going to speak to us about the uses of black music, both jazz and hip hop, as tools of cultural diplomacy. Hisham.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me? Yeah, well enough. And thank you, Joni, for this wonderful opportunity. I'm going to talk about the uses of music for cultural diplomacy, comparing initiatives from the Cold War with initiatives of the last 10 years, comparing jazz diplomacy with hip-hop diplomacy. But let me begin by giving you sort of a brief overview of how jazz was used during the Cold War, as Ambassador Schneider referred to. And this is a chapter from my book, which is in the back, by the way. I'm going to talk about the chapter on hip hop. Following after World War II, as British and French colonies gained their independence, they found themselves wooed by the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, who were eager to expand their spheres of influence. Washington's efforts were complicated by Soviet propaganda. Soviet propaganda tended to focus on racial strife in the American South, deliberately broadcasting images, for instance, of the killing of Emmett Till and so on. And President Eisenhower, who had been rather complacent about civil rights, began to see that internationally, race was America's Achilles heel. And so the State Department began organizing high-profile jazz tours to alter impressions. The jazz tours were the brainchild of Adam Clayton Powell, the Democratic congressman from Harlem who conceived of jazz as a Cold War weapon, right? Who was tired of hearing the Soviet Union claiming that it was more progressive on race. So he proposed to the State Department that bands led by Dizzy Gillespie, Count Basie, Louis Armstrong be sent overseas to improve America's image. As Adam Clayton Powell would tell President Eisenhower, one dark face from the US is of as much value as millions of dollars in economic aid. Top diplomats welcomed this idea. The main goal of the tours were to bolster alliances and persuade non-aligned states that were on the fence, that the US is different from former colonial powers and from the Soviet Union. And so in March 1956, Dizzy Gillespie and his arranger, a young trumpeter named Quincy Jones, embarked on the first tour. Their first performance took place in Iran, where 3 years earlier, a CIA-backed coup had overthrown Mossadegh, democratically elected Mossadegh, and reinstalled the Shah to power. But Dizzy Gillespie's 18-piece band would perform in Iran, then move on to Syria, Lebanon, Pakistan, Turkey, Greece, and Yugoslavia. There's some wonderful work on these jazz tours, which I reference. And my interest is the collaborations that occurred during these jazz tours. And there are some wonderful anecdotes in the memoirs of the jazz ambassadors. For example, in Syria, trombonist Melba Liston, one of the few women to take part in the jazz tours, would learn the Syrian national anthem from a group of school children, then perform her own jazzed-up version to the delight of local audiences. Likewise, in Damascus, Duke Ellington was hailed with shouts of "I shall Duke" and carried on people's shoulders, right, in the audience. And these integrated bands visited the Soviet Union, parts of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Their performances aimed at generating goodwill and getting citizenries to identify with the American way of life. The bands were intended to be symbols of the triumph of democracy, with jazz serving as an embodiment of America's liberal ideals and its improvisational pluralism and its universal race-transcending quality. But another reason that jazz was chosen was because of the very rich cross-fertilization that was occurring between jazz and Islam in the first part of the 20th century. You had a number of prominent jazz musicians, such as Yusuf Lateef, Ahmed Jamal, who embraced Islam and began drawing on the musical traditions of West Africa, North Africa, and Asia to create a whole new genre, a subgenre of jazz known as world music jazz. At any rate, as far as these jazz tours are concerned, the great irony, as you know, is that these black musicians were deployed to improve the country's image and legitimize policies at a time when the US was still a Jim Crow nation. There was such opposition to these tours at home that when the jazz artists were touring, State Department officials at home scrambled to prevent images of the tours from reaching Southern segregationists. In this task, ironically, they were aided by the Smith-Mundt Act, the so-called anti-propaganda law, which was passed in 1948 by Congress, which then suspected that the State Department was full of communists And the law was passed to prevent the output of the U.S. Information Agency from being broadcast to American audiences, right? So what's broadcast overseas cannot be broadcast at home. More on this in a moment. Nevertheless, the tours which ended in the 1970s are widely considered a success, right? Almost unanimously. The Harvard scholar Ingrid Minson speaks of the extraordinary success of the jazz tours. Pianist David Brubeck thought the jazz ambassadors helped end the Cold War. Just last week, Quincy Jones was on the Leonard Lopez show, and he said jazz brought down the Berlin Wall as well. So people firmly believe that jazz helped end the Cold War. Obviously not. This audience knows that the music didn't end the Cold War, didn't bring down the Soviet Union. But I do think that their impact, the impact of these jazz tours, their impact musically was quite extraordinary, especially in the case of artists like Dave Brubeck, who met and mentored young musicians. In 2009, at the 50th anniversary of Brubeck's Rondo a la Turk, a classic record, they had a 50th anniversary at Jazz Lincoln Center, and the album actually was inspired by the tour that he did of Turkey in 1959. He was walking the streets of Istanbul, heard a rhythm, and incorporated it. And of course, this record would go on to become a classic. Anyhow, at the anniversary, he brought on stage a number of Turkish musicians that he had mentored over the decades, and it was really a wonderful sight. Likewise, as a result, and there were a number of artists who did this, actually. You had Louis Armstrong in Egypt, you had Randy Weston in Morocco, Pharoah Sanders, and so on. And some of the musical compositions that would come out of the tours were astonishing. Duke Ellington would compose the album Far East Suite, 1966. After his 1963 tour of Iran and Afghanistan, the album includes the well-known number Isfahan, about Iran, which I encourage you to listen to look up. That same tour took Ellington to Kabul, Afghanistan, and he would always tell the story how when he was performing in Kabul, he was playing Mood Indigo, right? Midway through the performance, the audience gets up and leaves, right? And they continue playing, they don't know what's going on, they just continue jamming and so on. Then somebody tells them, oh, they went to pray evening prayer, and then they came back, right? Anyhow, so the literature around the jazz tours is wonderful to read. The jazz tours are deemed to have been so successful that they were revived after 9/11. And they were revived in 2005. The Jazz Diplomacy Initiative of the Cold War was revived in a program called Rhythm Road, a partnership of the State Department, Jazz at Lincoln Center, and BAM, I believe. And Karen Hughes, the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, introduced the program after being appointed by President Bush in the wake of Abu Ghraib, the scandal of Abu Ghraib and the resurgence of the Taliban. And in 2005, the State Department began appointing hip-hop ambassadors, right? Hip-hop envoys, an official position, rappers, dancers, DJs, who would be sent overseas to perform and speak in different parts of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Tony Blackman, a spoken word artist from Washington, D.C., would be appointed, would get that official title. Other groups would go on tour, and their shows would span the entire range of the Muslim world, right, from Senegal to Mongolia. The hip-hop ambassadors who are Muslim talk to local media about being Muslim in America and the freedoms they enjoy, and so on. For American diplomacy, hip-hop has emerged as the music of choice for perception management, quote-unquote, and strategic communication, quote-unquote, with young Muslims. Why hip-hop? Because of American hip-hop's long-standing relationship to Islam. As many of you know, and I detail this in the book, hip-hop emerges in the Bronx in the early 70s. And from the beginning, there's a very interesting cross-fertilization, right? Hip-hop is deeply influenced by Islamic movements, quasi-Islamic movements that exist in the American urban center. So you have Sunni Islam, Nation of Islam, 5%er influencing lyrics, allusions, references from the beginning, right? Since the early 70s, I can talk about this further, but particularly during the golden age of hip hop, you had a very visible Islamic influence. For that reason, hip-hop resonates among Muslim youth. Neither hard rock nor heavy metal has the same appeal to Muslims. And if you look at the research on music and interrogation in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's rarely a mention of hip-hop. With the exception of Eminem's track White America, the songs used to break down detainees were almost exclusively hard rock and metal, right? Hip-hop is used more for cultural persuasion. So it's not unusual today to read State Department reports, brochures, catalogs and so on that speak of hip-hop as a natural connector to the Muslim world, and with planners calling for the leveraging of hip-hop in U.S. foreign policy. And I must emphasize that the hip-hop program fits into a larger effort to showcase the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle, starting with the experience of African Muslim slaves in the American South. Right? Policymakers can see that the war on terror and the range of punitive policies directed at Muslim communities in the West have pushed Muslim youth towards race activism and triggered an interest in the civil rights movement and the African American experience more broadly. So the African American experience is actually at the core of American cultural diplomacy today and of American soft power. Again, regarding hip-hop, jazz was deployed because it represents American inclusiveness, American pluralism. Hip-hop is deployed because it represents civil rights protest, right? If you look at the writing about hip-hop, it represents protest and resistance, and it's part of an effort to trigger some sort of a protest movement. And one of the, again, was doing research for the book, one of the most striking things is the debate about hip-hop within the foreign policy establishment, right, in Europe and in America. But talking about one of the odder phenomena of the last decade is hearing national security elites, terrorism experts, career diplomats, people who involve, figures, artists who don't really engage in hip-hop, discuss the finer points of flow and bling in the politics of cool. And to hear classical musicians, for example, talk about hip-hop, Yo-Yo Ma, for example, has started doing hip-hop collaborations. The French-American cellist now has a show with a young dancer called Lil Buck, and so Yo-Yo Ma is doing hip-hop now, right? And I'm told that when he does these hip-hop shows, he changes his name to Yo Mama. Maybe it's not true. Now, is this all working? Looking at Pew polling, not quite, I would say. Right? I mean, if you look at sort of the polling perceptions of the United States, North Africa, Middle East, South Asia, and so on, perceptions have not significantly improved in the last 7 years for the transition from President Bush to Obama. Where you do see perceptions improving is in Europe, right? And policies towards minorities in Europe, Muslim communities in Europe. And I would say the reason for that is that European Muslims, European minorities are not living under American-backed tyranny. Right? They're free, and they actually use their relationship to the American embassy and the financial assistance from the American embassy to leverage more concessions from their local governments. So Dutch Muslims, French Muslims, British Muslims, you do see some improvement there. But I want to talk about some debates, some legal debates that have arisen around the use of music diplomacy. There's the first debate really has to do with the propaganda laws that I've mentioned, and the second debate has to do with the Establishment Clause. Let me begin with first the Establishment Clause. Sam Roscoff, a legal scholar who directed the NYPD's intelligence unit, he notes that the cultural ambassadors, the cultural envoys that are sent overseas by the United States, are often selected according to a theological standard. It is generally Sufi-oriented artists who are sent overseas, right? Sort of liberal, mystical, and so on, as they're described. And he wonders if this doesn't contravene the Establishment Clause, the constitutional provision that says the government should not establish religion or take sides in religious debates. In this case, Muslim debates about the permissibility of music. So there's a delicate question there about the Establishment Clause and establishing religion and what side to take. Another question that legal scholars are raising has to do with whether these performances are violating the anti-propaganda laws. I mentioned the Smith-Mundt Act earlier. Some of these laws are still on the books. The laws prohibit these shows from being broadcast to the United States, to American audiences, because they're deemed propaganda. But what's happening nowadays in our global age is that performances overseas are being uploaded where they can be viewed and commented upon by American audiences. And so you have two-way conversations taking place, which are actually not allowed by a number of these publicity or propaganda writers. Last year, the Smith-Mundt Act was actually amended precisely to allow VOA to broadcast in Somali to American audiences. The hip-hop diplomacy initiatives have also sparked a debate within the hip-hop community, more so outside the US, on what is the purpose of rap? What is the purpose of hip-hop? Is it protest music? Is it party music? Is it the soundtrack of struggle? Or is it the sound of American state power? And American hip-hop fans also note the irony that the very music blamed for a range of social ills at home, violence, misogyny, consumerism, is being deployed overseas in the hopes of making America safer and better liked. Wrap up. Okay, yes. All right, I'll stop right there. I want to show a couple of clips, if it's possible. Let me set up the first clip. This is one of the things I'm worried about. I mean, you do have the cultural exchange, and it's wonderful and so on. But sometimes you have artists coming under attack when they're sent to conflict zones and so on. And the clip I'm going to show you is of a group, a dance troupe from Chicago, who performed in Pakistan. And it all went well, according to this report. But afterwards, they would be detained and arrested by the Pakistani authorities, and their show would be canceled, right? So I want to show you just the kind of work that they do and the risks that these kids are taking. Thanks, Blake.
Gunboat diplomacy was a favourite of the Cold War. Relations break down with a country, you send an aircraft carrier over there, point some missiles at them, and watch them suddenly cheer up a bit. But these are modern times, so how does the US rebuild relations with beleaguered and suspicious ally Pakistan? Shows of military force won't go down well in a country routinely hit by US drone strikes and where only 12% of the population support you. So how about a different kind of battle? Cue hip-hop diplomacy. This is the FEW Collective from Chicago, and they're America's ambassadors of funk, bringing their weapons of rap, breakdance, and poetry to an adoring crowd of teenagers in Islamabad. These are kids who've enjoyed a westernized education, so they aren't exactly the hardest of crowds to please.
It's a very interesting event because they want to bring a bit of their culture as well as they're using parts of our culture in their show as well, I've heard.
These guys are just scratching the surface, so to speak, but if it works, beats not bombs might just be the future.
I'm going to show a couple more. Is that okay? 20 seconds. One more? One more? All right, let me jump to the last one. Actually, can you cue up low key? And again, in the foreign policy community, the debate about hip-hop over the last 10 years is that hip-hop can be a radicalizing force, right? Is that some of the hard left ideas that you get in hip-hop are what push youth towards extremist ideologies and so on. And so part of the purpose of cultural diplomacy, hip-hop diplomacy, is to present a counter-narrative. So I want to play you a clip by a very popular young artist named Low Key, based in Britain. And he's deeply influenced by the black struggle in the United States. He doesn't get much play on the radio and on the airwaves, but he's very popular. And his story is, narrating the history of empire and how, why empire is central to our memory. So the themes that you see, Guantanamo, Black Power, and so on.
So, we must ask ourselves, what is the dictionary definition of terrorism? The systematic use of terror, especially as a means of coercion. But what is terror? According to the dictionary I hold in my hand, terror is violent or destructive acts, such as bombing, committed by groups in order to intimidate a population or government into granting their demands. So what's a terrorist?
They calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terror is. When they put it on me, I tell them this: I'm all about peace and love. Peace and love. But they calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terror is. Insulting my intelligence. Oh, how these people judge.
It seems like the ragheads and packies are worrying your dad, but your dad's favorite food is curry and kebab. It's funny, but it's sad how they make your mommy hurry with her bags.
I want to end on a positive note, so I'm going to play you a last clip by a gentleman about a gentleman named Maurice El Medioni, who's a well-known pianist. He's a friend of mine. I dedicate the book to him. But his story is really incredible. Just to talk about the impact of the jazz tours. Maurice El-Medyouni is from Oran, Algeria, an Algerian Jew. He grew up trained playing the piano, playing Andalusi style with his right hand. When he was 12 years old, Vichy took over Algeria. He would be stripped of his French citizenship, along with Jacques Derrida, the philosopher. And then Operation Torch happens. The Americans land, they liberate North Africa, and he learns from Latino servicemen and African-American servicemen how to play rumba and jazz and ragtime with his right hand, with his left hand, right? And he would incorporate the nuba and the jazz and create an entire new genre, just talking about the impact of the jazz tours. Here he talks about how he learned how to play in his own colorful way.
America goes to war. Men of the Army, Navy, and Marines reinforce the battlefronts on 6 continents to save the homes and ideals of free men from Axis domination.
Ils buvaient beaucoup de whisky, ils buvaient de la bière, ils buvaient quand ils étaient sur... When I reach eyes are smiling. Hey boy, hey play me. You know, la cucaracha. You play me la cucaracha. They were drunk. Ils étaient sous, ils étaient une ambiance terrible. Et il y avait sur le piano, le patron, il m'a mis un plateau. Et je gagnais bien ma vie. Et un jour, il rentre un soldat noir américain. Il était debout à côté de moi, il m'a regardé jouer. Il me dit, "Can you let me your piano, please?" Je suis sure. Yeah, why not? Et je l'ai vu jouer du boogie-woogie. J'ai vu cette main gauche jouée par ce noir. J'ai dit, quelle merveilleuse musique. Il ne m'a pas appris, mais je le voyais jouer, je rentrais à la maison, j'imitais tout ce qu'il a fait et je réussissais à le faire. Et c'est comme ça que j'ai appris le boogie.
Thank you.